Matt Hongoltz-Hetling is one of my favorite writers, and he is out with a new book that, I'm going to say right off the bat, has a misleading subtitle. It's called Ghost Lab, How Bigfoot Hunters, Mediums, and Alien Enthusiasts Are Wrecking Science. And it's not that they're not wrecking science. It's more of an understanding of the personalities, some specific New Hampshire-based personalities, what drives them to find specific kinds of phantasms, and what this means or what this indicates for the overall state of trust in the United States becoming a low-trust society. I'm going to read you a short passage to give you a sense of Matt's ability as a prose stylist. According to one online register, nearly 50 different New Hampshire-based ghost hunting groups popped up in 2008 and 2009. The actual number is almost certainly higher. Spirit hunting was so hot that it seemed the state motto could plausibly have been changed to live free or die, and then after you die, meet me in a dark house after midnight and say one or two indistinct words into my recorder. See, if you know me, you know I love writing like that, jokes like that, but also insights like that. Matthew, welcome back to The Gist.
Mike, what a wonderful introduction. Please ply me with my own prose. I will sit here and listen to your mellifluous voice all day.
But how do you plead to my charge that I think the subtitle comes in a little hot, given that I read the whole book and it seems to be more about understanding a phenomenon as opposed to decrying a trend?
Yeah, no, I am with you 1,000% on that. This was the biggest, a little inside baseball, biggest internal discussion that I have ever participated in within the confines of my publishing house. And there were various schools of thought about what was appropriate and what wasn't. This is the one that won out. But I do think, to address sort of the substance of what you're talking about, they are, they're not out there with a wrecking ball trying to knock science down. What they're doing is reforming, right? And sort of like opening the lens a little bit, so that science can sort of like accommodate these experiences that they are having. But of course, I also talk quite a bit about, as you said, the state of trust and mistrust and distrust in the United States, and the way that they view the world has an awfully big impact on that. In a way,
yeah. So let's talk. Let's
really
talk about
yeah.
them. Let's talk about your main characters. Let's talk about Andy, and let's talk about the research institute, the KIT Research Institute that they're affiliated with. Who was KIT? What are they researching?
All right. So Andy KIT is a really interesting character. He's one of these. I'm a straight shooter. I'm going to tell it like it is. I don't care who I offend. And he became convinced that his recently departed father was communicating to him from beyond the grave. And he took up this sort of cause to try to look more into that, and also to sort of like mold his life and form an organization with this stated goal of sort of bringing science into paranormal phenomena, including but not limited to ghost hunting. And so he's a New Hampshire Seacoast resident. He'd kind of bounced around for most of his life. He'd never really settled into any sort of a career. But he, and at the time that the book opens, he is a student at the University of New Hampshire.
He's curious. He has others, especially in New Hampshire. This seems to be very hot in New Hampshire to ghost hunt, to paranormal hunt. Why is that, do you think?
Yeah, well, New Hampshire is sort of like in this odd place where, one, it's in New England, which is, sort of like the oldest part of the country.
Right.
Its house
easily
is
haunted,
creakiest.
biggest availability just in terms of ghost demographics. Got it.
Correct. They love those dusty attics. And that's, of course, attics. Let's not cast aspersions.
Attics, yeah.
But also because New Hampshire has this just really sort of unique place in ghost hunting and paranormal history. Historically, it's been home to sort of like the two most influential teams of ghost hunters in history. The first being Ed and Lorraine Warren, who gave rise to all sorts of conventions in our popular understanding of ghosts today. The evil talking doll, that's a Warrenism. The idea of sort of blood running down the walls, that's a Warrenism. And Ed and Lorraine Warren, they were, sort of fancied themselves as demonologists, where they saw themselves going out and fighting these sort of like evil entities on behalf of God and doing something, adjacent to exorcisms. Their time came and went. And their time came because they cast things in a religious bent at a time when America was a more religious nation. Their time went because A, religion was on the decline in the 80s and 90s, and B, because cell phones were becoming more ubiquitous, right? And as soon as cell phones came out, their sort of wilder tales, like, for example, of a demonically possessed person turning into a gorilla, was just sort of not bearing out. So it was time for a new standard bearer.
You need the cell phone documentation of that to really rebut it. Yes, I understand.
That's right. That's right. And then, sort of like just as their star was fading, New England produced another pair of ghost hunters. This were the folks behind the Ghost Hunters TV show that I think probably most of your listeners are familiar with, where these are the guys who sort of like invented that television. It's become a whole genre now of people clunking around in haunted properties overnight in black and white infrared cameras and trying to sort of investigate what they saw as a paranormal phenomena. So they know.
And by phenomenon, not just paranormal, but TV shows about the paranormal. In 2015, 10 years since Ghost Hunters started, there were 109 paranormal reality shows produced and aired. The Travel Channel abandoned topics like food, beaches, hotel, and culture, i.e. travel, into an almost all paranormal slate of programs that resulted in a 15% bump in viewership. So the culture at large, Ghost Hunters, though based in New Hampshire, it's a national show. The culture was trending towards an embrace of the paranormal. You talk a little bit about technology and cell phones, but there's also something in the air. And as we embrace the paranormal, we distance ourselves from the quantifiable. And that is, you have so many statistics about our trust in institutions really degrading, and New Hampshire being the epicenter of this. How do you, can you tell me some of the reasons that you say this or some of the stats that you cite?
Yeah, actually, when I started researching the book, I wasn't even looking for information about ghosts. I started researching distrust, and New Hampshire, as you say, is a national leader in distrust. The number of New Hampshireites who believe that government is doing a good job, or, that they trust their government, is equal to the number who think that government is in the control of some Satan worshiping pedophiles. Right?
14%. Yeah.
Yeah, it's 14%, and that's nuts. And in fact, more people work for the government than trust the government, right?
There we go.
That's another sort of shocking statistic. And so, and New Hampshire is also of particular interest, I think, to all of us, Mike, because the whole country is trending towards New Hampshire. Where the country is now, New Hampshire was 10 years ago. And where New Hampshire is now, the country seems to be racing towards full steam ahead. And so I thought this is really sort of like the, maybe not the canary in the coal mine, but the ghost of the canary in the coal mine. So let's take a look at this and really try to sort of understand and get behind just the idea that these are conspiracy theories. These are ridiculous supernatural views. What's going on here? Because if we don't understand it, how are we going to change it?
So you find Andy Kitt, and did you have a lot of paranormal enthusiasts to choose from, and he was the most colorful?
Yeah, I cast a pretty wide net. I talked to a witch who was an elected legislator in the state.
Yeah, which might seem impressive, but New Hampshire has more elected legislators than anywhere else.
That's right. That's right.
Which, by the way, New Hampshire hates government, but they have a lot of it. And one of the arguments about government is that we are so distant from our representatives. But in New Hampshire, not statewide, but in New Hampshire, a legislator represents like 2,000 or 3,000 people. And I could also throw in there that, we have a primary there first because we, respect how into the political process granite staters are. Chris Sununu is seen as, he gets good marks for being a moderate. So it does seem weird that New Hampshire in some ways exemplifies some of the correctives about what's bad about our political process, and yet the trust is the lowest.
Yeah, it's an absolute conundrum, isn't it, Mike? This is sort of like the place where people say, "Oh yeah, my state legislature, he's in my poker club, he's at my grocery store." Like they have a personal relationship. Many people do with their state representative, and yet they still sort of reject the system, the collective, as corrupt. I guess it's like trusting your family doctor, but not the system, not the medical system.
Yeah. So you thought about the witch. You thought about who else?
Yeah, like a woman who ran a haunted crepe restaurant. All these different places. But what was appealing to Andy was that Andy had assembled sort of like a team. He had assembled sort of like the Avengers of the supernatural landscape. So
if they were all the Scarlet Witch, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. He had sort of brought together a psychic medium, an empath, a paralegal who also heard voices in her head, and
so a paranormal paralegal.
A paranormal paralegal, exactly.
Okay, great.
And a Bigfoot enthusiast, Bigfoot hunter, who also happened to be an alien abductee. So like this little group right here, like sort of like summed up all of the major strains of thought and sort of like competing schools within the paranormal community. And so that combined with this sort of noble mission that they had to inject science into these fields really appealed to me, because I thought these guys are really going to be able to tell me a lot about what is going on out there.
And the alien abductee, it wasn't just a one-time thing with him, right?
Correct. This is Mike Stevens. He love
this guy.
He was a very he's a character, and he was abducted at the age of 3 or 4 years old. Had some gaps in time that were later filled in through regressive hypnosis, and he is sort of like like a classic rural New Hampshire strong kind of a guy. He's got the deep voice, the heavy New Hampshire accent. He's got the tattoos. And he's got, you just sort of like, breathes blue collar, sort of a knockabout.
Yeah.
And he was abducted, many times throughout his life, but he was also sort of struggling with life. He struggled with, alcohol consumption. He had some health issues. And so, some people would look at that and say the alcoholism, I don't want to call him an alcoholic, but his issues with alcohol may have sort of like given him the false impression that he was an alien abductee. But what he and people in the community would tell you is that the trauma of abduction, whatever sort of like form that trauma took, is so great as to cause mental health problems in the afflicted. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation. Yeah,
it is. And it's also, and this is characteristic of a lot of the paranormal community, so many of these claims are unfalsifiable. When they seem to be falsified, there's always another reason. But this is where Andy is a bit of an exception. He adheres to, as you document in the book, something close to the scientific method, if not strict rigor.
Yeah, absolutely. Andy was like, he's a very bright guy. He's very capable of pursuing a thing, sort of like he can follow the instructions, right? And he really set himself in a very dedicated way to the study of the scientific method and scientific process. And he's in classes, so he's getting all sorts of like real information, like sort of like right from actual practicing scientists about how they're doing their research. And he is starting to apply those principles to his field. Like, he sort of realized right away, like, running around with a recorder doesn't matter if that recorder is not well understood as a scientific tool. It's a measurement tool, it's a recording tool, but what are its blind spots? What are its strengths? How can we calibrate it and ensure accuracy? How can we come up with a double-blind experiment? And all of these sorts of real, actual science things that went far beyond what we see on the Ghost Hunters television show. He was sort of trying to harness and employ to study these things.
Now, did the solid phantasm, was that the white whale to Andy's Ahab?
Yeah, I think so. The solid phantom. Yes. So
solid phantom. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah. And so, there was just this sort of idea, and this is pervasive among throughout the community, that they have so many experiences that are so on their face evident to the people who are experiencing them that it's almost impossible to think that there's not some way to document this, to capture this for the men in white coats, right? To bring this into a laboratory and figure it out. And they go about this with sort of like great optimism and enthusiasm in their efforts. And one of the things that was sort of like confounding to that purpose is, the experiences that happen cannot be summoned, in any reliable way. You're putting yourself in a place where you think that these things are. You're almost like a field biologist. I think at one point I compared it to like if Jane Goodall was out there studying invisible chimpanzees, right? She's not sure when it's going to pop up. And so that makes it a little bit more difficult to bring back into a laboratory clinical environment. You think you're going to get that solid phantom and that this is going to revolutionize our way of thought. This is the potential way to revolutionize science, right? Getting back to sort of like the subtitle discussion. This is the transformative potential of the movement. If they could just, show us a glass jar with a ghost trapped inside it that behaved and acted like a ghost, then we would all be thinking about this in a much different way.
How down do Andy, Bo, the other people in Kit get at any point? And do you have to, are you there for them when they're at their lowest?
Their group has some real highs in terms of like shared experiences and real bonds of love and friendship forming among them. And then they have some real lows, both in sort of like their repeated inability to get the documentation that they're searching for, through the financial strictures of their endeavor, which sort of like are driving them to desperation in various ways. And also in sort of like finding out that their personal priorities, for some of them at some times conflicted with the stated mission of the group, which was to bring science in. Andy,
so go ahead, tell me how. Tell me, get into that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So Andy was the person who put science the highest, no questions asked. He only wanted to platform paranormal ideas that he believed were viable, that were not demonstrably false. But Bo Esby, the psychic medium, she sort of like learned throughout the course of her association with Andy that she actually wanted to be more experience-based. Like she found a personal experience to be compelling evidence in a way that Andy did not. And this is a really important distinction. And also Mike Stevens, the alien abductee, he wound up founding sort of like a peer group, a support group, sort of like in the model of Alcoholics Anonymous, but for alien abductees under the auspices of the Kit Research Organization. And so at these meetings, these sort of like psychic tap-in meetings being held by Bo, and at these support group meetings, people are getting up and saying stuff that's not true. It's almost certainly false. And Andy wants to root that stuff out. He wants to call them on that, call it BS and throw them out of the room and confront it as misinformation. But Bo and Mike found within themselves a capacity to be more inclusive, that it's more sort of like important to honor and respect the experience of the individual. And if you throw that in another setting, that makes perfect sense. There are all sorts of things where we might extend sympathy to someone's cultural differences that shape their view of the world in a way that seems on its face very right. I've heard arguments sort of like defending child abuse in other countries, right? Because that is sort of like their cultural heritage and tradition. Very different forms of abuse.
Or even the discussion around lived experience and questioning the primacy of double-blind studies or documentable truth. And when we throw away lived experience, where in some contexts it would be seen as we're doing a misdeed.
Absolutely, yeah, and that is sort of like the crux of where they started to see like a fissure form within the group. Is that if you are valuing the individual experience, when that comes into conflict with a scientific understanding of the universe, then you are saying that there's not a shared reality, that facts are subjective, that every experience is valid. And this is, a really threatening thing. If you sort of take it out of the paranormal box and you see how these worldviews are sort of shaping how they're understanding things in the broader culture of politics. If I have a ghostly experience and I'm convinced that ghosts are real, and then I go and look at the scientific establishment, I think this is crazy. A majority of Americans have had ghost experiences. We all know that they're out there. Why is science pretending that it's not there? Are they sort of willfully turning a blind eye to it? Are they corrupt in some way? And so it's a very, very short leap of logic to conclude that the scientific institutions that sort of like underpin our science and our public policy and everything else are just sort of flat out wrong, that they're not a very good tool for understanding the universe because they don't even understand ghosts. Who's to say that they understand vaccines or, all of these other things?
So do you think, is your assessment that, well, let's go back 20, 30 years. And as you chronicle, there have always been, especially in New Hampshire, a lot of paranormal enthusiasts. But there was a time when they, and this is also true of, separatists, they were seen as kooky, but if not harmless, then certainly not potent, right? And then it could be a technology issue that all these disparate, harmless individual nodes were able to get together and become more potent. So that's one explanation. But another is that the institutions just weren't delivering as they once had. They weren't working for society. You talk a lot about colleges and a lot in the book about the University of New Hampshire and certain colleges that shut down. Just the percentage of people within a decade who said they wanted to send their children to college, going from in the 90s to in the 40s. So I'm thinking about the explanations that you get into in the book. Why did this once mostly harmless, but certainly fringe phenomenon that has parallels all throughout our cultural life, why did it become so much more popular? Why did it begin to threaten institutions? Or do you think that institutions showed themselves to be not up to the task, and then into that more rushed explanations like the paranormal?
Yeah, I think there's definitely an argument to be made that this is sort of like the reasonable response to flawed institutions, right? Robert Putnam, who wrote the book Bowling Alone, great book on public loneliness. He wrote, he said rather, do we have a trust issue or do we have a trustworthiness issue? So like, our institutions earning our trust. And there's a lot of sociological research that shows that when people are in situations where they don't feel stable, They don't feel like they're in control. They don't feel like they have an opportunity to better their own lives, that they are much more likely to turn to the supernatural. There's a great example from the early 1900s of a sociologist who went to a remote island and observed sort of like indigenous people's fishing rituals. And the folks who fished in the coral reefs just sort of like stuck a stick with a poisoned root on the end of it into a hole in the reef, and the fish would flee out of the reef, and then they would catch them in a net. It was a surefire thing. You got it whenever you wanted it, and there was no superstitious ritual associated with that practice. But when those same fishermen wanted to go out and get a shark, which was like a very fraught and dangerous and unsure experience, then they had this whole raft of superstitious rituals that they had to follow to try to get that shark. So they would abstain from loud talking in the village for like a month, and no singing, and the women had to stay indoors. Just all of these very like sort of restrictive taboos. And then when they would go out in their fishing boats, they would try to bash these sharks in the head with driftwood, essentially, which is nuts.
Right.
So I think in our lives today, it's the same principle, same dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, from my own perspective, I don't think our institutions have gotten worse. And remember, our institutions are just the collective of the human beings who make up the institutions. I think that there have definitely been some examples where they've been found wanting, and the pandemic, I would say, in many ways showed our institutions to be kind of miraculous. In other ways, showed, especially, the public health officials to be poor communicators, let's say. So I think what's really going on is our institutions are generally getting marginally better, but our analysis of the institutions and our conception of the institutions have fallen off a cliff. I think this is mostly aided and abetted by technology, both the profusion of it and also how the algorithms select for, disturbing stuff. So you add all that, I could see why there is a crisis upon us. That would be my assessment.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that whatsoever. Yeah, like the internet, so there's sort of like the reality of flawed institutions, right? And we all agree that there are things that they can and should be doing better to address things like, income inequality and all these other things, accessibility of healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. But there's sort of like, it seems like this growing gap between the reality of an institution and our perception of those institutions, right? And that is, I think, what you're talking to. And I think what you've said is correct. It's we're getting wrapped in digital bubbles. It's that in this hyper-partisan time, there's sort of like a vested interest in portraying the other side in ways that are very exaggerated and far beyond their actual issues.
Yeah. So people are going to flock to more accessible stories, stories that work better for them than the stories of the institution. And here is the IMF and it will improve your life. Or here is the WPA. And we could certainly say that improved your life once the institutions stop having that very clear delivery on the promise that you're, of course, going to get all manner of belief in the paranormal, but also the extreme, but, also just that which rebuts the institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And this actually sort of like ties back into what you were saying earlier. Like in New Hampshire, there's arguably sort of like more closeness to the public. There is more transparency and opportunity for access to their public institutions, and yet they're among the least trustful in the nation, right? Yeah. And so why is that happening? What is that sort of like veil that's inserting itself in between the people and the institutions that serve them?
Yeah. Also, well, I don't know how much this factors in, but we are told that trust and low trust societies versus high trust society, one way to have a high trust society tends to be the homogeneity of the populace, when you recognize your fellow citizen as being in your same tribe, that leads to more trust. But New Hampshire is racially homogeneous. It doesn't have as much. Every state is affected by immigration, but doesn't have as much immigration, I don't think, as a lot of other states that are supposed to be destabilizing. There's a lot of confounding factors going on in New Hampshire, I think.
Yeah, New Hampshire is sort of like a place that celebrates individualism, right? And
Sure.
there's a whole school of thought out there that individualism is sort of like quickly becoming the new religion, right? That it's just taken everything over. And so I think in New Hampshire, maybe we're seeing a little bit of that. Rates of church attendance in New Hampshire are very, very low. And though I have not been kind to the church in many ways, I will say that they are a binder of society, that they are sort of like a collective school of thought that people can sort of like connect through and sort of like be a part of a more homogenous community. And New Hampshire doesn't have that. New Hampshire instead has sort of like a lot of it's got a lot of libertarians, as I've spoken about in the past.
Right. This is the topic of your book, A Libertarian Walks Into a Bear.
Right. And those guys are all about, sort of like celebrating the individual at the expense of the collective. So I think that's really deeply sort of like bred into New Hampshire's past and history and culture in a way that it wouldn't be for neighboring states like, Vermont or Massachusetts.
So there's a few very interesting ideas, possible small correctives. And one is the use of destigmatization to perhaps address some of the excesses of the paranormal movement. How would that work?
Yeah, this is like a view that I've come to embrace reluctantly, right? That I think, science and evidence-based institutions are sort of like reluctant to give any sort of time of day to paranormal belief systems because they don't want to make those things more relevant. But I think that what's actually happening is that the scales have tipped and science needs to maintain its relevance. Yeah. And part of the way that it can do that is by sort of like, in a very practical sense, create a space for these sorts of things. There maybe ought to be some more people in science who are looking into paranormal phenomena that are not getting laughed out of the room. This sort of like culture of hard debunk, hard dismissiveness creates a culture gap between those, sort of like plays into the stereotype of elitist and academic ivory towers and all of that. I think they need to cool on that a little bit. They need to tell better stories about science to sort of recapture their own messaging. But another way, that I talk about is I think that government agencies, government entities ought to sort of license psychics and ghost hunters and mediums, because these people are out there providing public services with no controls, with no sort of like limiting factor other than their ability to turn a buck. And so I think that we don't license ghost hunters because we don't want to sort of like put a stamp of authority on something that might seem foolish. Right. But if they were licensed, then perhaps they could be impelled upon not to, act in ways that could result in damage to a grave site, not act in ways that are a threat to the public. And when they encounter somebody who's hearing voices in their head or has a persistent feeling of unease, that they will have some sort of a training that allows them to funnel some of those people into the medical system to receive treatment that they probably need.
I think New Jersey might license psychics. but not as psychics per se. But if you operate as an unlicensed storefront psychic, you can get into trouble.
Yeah, there's a handful of places that that license like fortune tellers or fortune telling. These are like old laws on the books. They basically say like, if you're a criminal, you can't be a psychic, and they leave it at that, and you got to pay your $30 registration fee or whatever. New York bans them entirely, right? But it only enforces it when there's a problem. There's like this whole like sort of like subclass of illegal psychics operating in storefronts in full plain sight of everybody, sort of like sex services,
Yeah. Well, the psychics also know when the fuzz is coming. That's one thing about trying to catch a psychic. Yeah, it's all interesting. It's all the epiphenomenon is the parts of the book. I love how you write, and I love meeting, and the characters drive the story of the book. But the epiphenomenon was often things that I didn't consider. So I really actually appreciate that. And as far as, but to go back, the idea of destigmatizing is valid, I think, only because when all you're left with is the stigma being what prevents the public from latching on to these ideas, it's like having a brick wall or a foundation that's being held together with spackle. If the foundation is strong and the brick is solid, you wouldn't have to rely on the stigma to make the case that science is real and paranormal activity isn't. But now that we're in this low trust environment, it does seem like it's being held together with just the stigma / spackle in my analogy.
Yeah, and why not bring these people in to become stakeholders in holding our institutions up instead of sort of like being forced to conclude that they are renegade outlaws with a belief system that is considered invalid in the halls of justice and authority.
So as you were doing the book, did your conception change about how you would regard the truth, the veracity of these claims? When you went in, did you say, well, I'll be open to it? But then after a while, when nothing was proved, did you stop even? When people would ask, so Matt, is there anything that you saw that you can't explain? Did you have an answer other than I'm not really thinking about it in that way? I am, a many decades long skeptic. I come in with like very, very little credence and openness in my heart for these sorts of beliefs. I will say that when I hear a creak in the house in the middle of the night, my mind goes to some weird places, right? But my heart will jump, and for a minute I'm thinking about a ghost. But in a real sense, in the daylight, I don't believe in this stuff at all, really. But what I sort of assumed was that when I started the book was that the people who did hold those beliefs were sort of stupid or lying or, maybe just trying to get attention to themselves and that sort of thing. And that was really how my perceptions evolved, was that I met a lot of people who were just very sort of like authentic, good, salt of the earth people and bright people. And I knew that they were sort of like giving me their very best, most honest answers for why they had these beliefs. And even though sometimes I could see that they were incorrect, there were other things that I could not explain, that I couldn't just sort of like debunk easily. Like I write in the book about there's this sort of like raccoon paperweight figurine that jumps off of a shelf for no reason when there's a small group of people 4 feet away playing with a Ouija board, right? And so I have, I can really bend over backwards and try to come up with a mundane explanation that conforms to our accepted principles of physics and science. But what Andy tells me is that is not the right way to look at it. The right way to look at it is to come to it with an open mind and come up with the simplest explanation, which to him is that a ghost toppled that thing off. I'll stick to thinking that there was a prankster in the room or that
a computer vibration slowly edged it over, and then it just sort of like fell at that moment by coincidence. But it's that sort of disagreement that really can never be fully resolved. Yeah, I'm not going to convince anybody of my way of thinking on that.
Could have been a ghost. Let's go with ghost. If ghost is the social lubricant that gets us to see each other for the full humans that we are, sure, it's a ghost.
Now, do you believe in any of that stuff?
No,
what's your worldview there?
Thank you for asking. Nothing, absolutely nothing. But I try to not just not come across as a totally dismissive jerk. I try actually to be a non-totally dismissive jerk, and I'm definitely failing in the second part. I'll tell you eternally. I hope in the first part I will nod and say, well, that's fun. Or, I'll do the thing where you write about certain cultures and their belief in jinn or genies, and that there's some provable efficacy in having this belief in terms of addressing some psychological maladies. And I could see that happening. Psychosomatic illness or the placebo effect, those are important things. And I don't know, if we didn't have good words for them that sounded scientific, wouldn't they be seeming almost supernatural? But they're real. So I kind of default to that and say I'm not going to be a total jerk about it.
Yeah, the jinn thing that you mentioned, that's like a really interesting example. Yeah, like in the Muslim world, somebody goes to a clinic and says that they've been possessed by a jinn, which is a very common belief there. And the doctors are sort of like equipped to deal with that in its own terms. And so, they'll call in like a holy person who will write down some powerful words from the Quran and dissolve those dissolve that paper with those words written on them in some water, and the afflicted drinks it, and sort of like Trojan horse into all that smoke and mirrors are some, things that we in the West would recognize as clinically important components of a treatment. There's a social check-in. There is sort of like a continued reason for conversing with the jinn later down the line. So you're not losing that patient. And here in the United States, an alien abductee, they can't get that. They walk in and tell their therapist that, or their doctor that they're going to get a drug, and they're going to get called delusional. And well may they be, right? Well may they be, but you've got to incentivize those folks to walk in the door, or else, next thing you know, they're out there holding anti-mask signs.
Well, I'll tell you, Matthew, there was a time in my 20s when I was certainly possessed by a jinn. I'm not sure if it was a Tanqueray or a Beefeater, but it was definitely a jinn. We definitely have to cut that. I just know you like a good line, or whatever the hell that was. I just know you appreciate an attempt at humor.
I want to put that in my next book.
Definitely. Yeah. Very culturally sensitive. Matthew Hongoltz-Hetling is the author before this of A Libertarian Walks Into a Bear, and If It Sounds Like a Quack. The new book is The Ghost Lab, How Bigfoot Hunters, Mediums, and Alien Enthusiasts Are Wrecking Science. And I would add, and how Matthew is explaining it. Thank you so much, Matt.
Mike, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for doing the good work that you do. We need your voice out there, and I'm so happy that we get to tune in and hear your take on things.